Hello, this is Helen Motti, and I want to welcome you to For Eternity.
I put my heart in your hands and you taught me to fly.
Hebrews 13, verses 1 to 3 exhorts us to let brotherly love continue. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing some have unwittingly entertained angels. Remember the prisoners as if chained with them, those who are mistreated, since you yourselves are in the body also. Before we travel to Sudan in this week's edition of For Eternity, I want to introduce you to a Russian captain from Romania who met Jesus Christ when Pastor Richard Wurmbrand, founder of Voice of the Martyrs, shared the gospel with him. Pastor Wurmbrand recalls, "Christianity has become dramatic with us," wrote Pastor Richard Wurmbrand, a leader of the underground church in communist Romania. "When Christians in free countries win a soul for Christ, the new believer may become a member of a quietly living church. But when those in captive nations win someone, we know that he may have to go to prison and that his children may become orphans. The joy of having brought someone to Christ is always mixed with this feeling that there is a price that must be paid." Wurmbrand continues, "When I was still living behind the Iron Curtain, I had met a Russian captain. He loved God, he longed after God, but he had never seen a Bible. He had never attended religious services. He had no religious education, but he loved God without the slightest knowledge of him. I read to him the Sermon on the Mount and the parables of Jesus. After hearing them, he danced around the room in rapturous joy, proclaiming, 'What a wonderful beauty! How could I live without knowing this Christ?' It was the first time that I saw someone jubilating in Christ. Then I made a mistake. I read to him the passion and crucifixion of Christ without having prepared him for this. He had not expected it. When he heard how Christ was beaten, how he was crucified, and that in the end he died, he fell in an armchair and began to weep bitterly. He had believed in a Saviour, and now his Saviour was dead. I looked at him and was ashamed that I had called myself a Christian and a pastor, a teacher of others. I had never shared the sufferings of Christ as this Russian officer now shared them. Looking at him was, for me, like seeing Mary Magdalene weeping at the foot of the cross or at the empty tomb. Then I read to him the story of the resurrection. When he heard this wonderful news that the Saviour arose from the tomb, he slapped his knees and shouted for joy, 'He is alive! He is alive!' Again he danced around the room, overwhelmed with happiness. I said to him, 'Let us pray.' He fell on his knees together with me. He did not know our holy phrases. His words of prayer were, 'O God, what a fine chap you are. If I were you and you were me, I would never have forgiven you your sins. But you are really a very nice chap. I love you with all my heart.' I think that all the angels in heaven stopped what they were doing to listen to this sublime prayer from this Russian officer. When this man received Christ, he knew he would immediately lose his position as an officer, that prison and perhaps death in jail would almost surely follow. He gladly paid the price. He was ready to lose everything." Glorious and frightening words, aren't they? He was ready to lose everything. In Australia at this time, these words and a conviction such as this are so foreign to me that I liken it to staring at a page of script written in Hindi or Arabic. It is unintelligible because I don't know the language. It makes no sense. It is just scribble on a page. And so it is with my experience and understanding of the true cost of New Testament biblical Christianity. I don't know the language of suffering for my faith as my brothers and sisters do daily across the globe. I have no comprehension of what it is to lose significant things, such as a job, a home, my freedom, my family, or my life, because I choose to be a follower of Christ. It costs me nothing or very little to be a Christian in this country. If I had met this Russian captain after his conversion, would I have really understood both the depths of his joy and the shattering reality that truly he had crossed from one kingdom to another, from the wide road to the narrow one, and that the cost would be great? Here is Nick Ripken, author of The Insanity of Obedience, with a poignant commentary.
What is a dagger in the heart to believers in persecution is our lack of understanding of how we connect with them. We've got a decision that we make every day. We can ask ourselves this question: do I want to identify with believers in persecution, or do I want to identify with their persecutors? Do I want to identify with the person in chains, or do I want to identify with the person that chained them? And when you ask them, well, how did I determine who I identify with? They say, by whether or not today you share Jesus with someone else or you keep him to yourself. Because the number one desire of Satan is to deny people access to Jesus. After 30 years overseas, there are some things we know. We know that there is a real spiritual battle between evil and good, God and Satan taking place. There's another thing that we know and that we get to decide. We get to decide whether we will be on the side of evil or whether we will accept Jesus and be on the side of good. The insanity of obedience, walking with Jesus in tough places, is all about being a good partner with Christ. The insanity of God was come to Jesus, cross the street, get on an airplane. The insanity of obedience is what we do once we cross the street, once we get off the airplane.
How do you do your work in such a way that when, not if, when persecution comes, it will be for who Jesus is and not for any other reason? And so the books are like bookends. One says, what causes me and helps me get on the plane? And the second one is, what do I do when I get off the plane?
Listen, if you want to know Jesus, fine. If you keep him to yourself, you can go to Saudi Arabia, you can go to Kuwait, you can go to Qatar, you can go to the Emirates, you can go to Oman, you can go anywhere and live a happy life if you just keep Jesus to yourself. But the people that we have been living with are those who choose to pick up Jesus and choose to pick up witness. And the point of identification with them is at the point of witness. What believers in persecution feel is that what we have for them is pity. And they said, don't pity us when we are beaten and jailed and even are killed for our faith. That is the time that you should give thanks to God, because our overt persecution is clear evidence that the covert, the quiet persecution, does not work. They are being persecuted because of their witness to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. One of the greatest gifts that believers in persecution have ever given us is this book that we call The Insanity of Obedience. Because at the heart of The Insanity of Obedience is how to bring our Bible, how to bring our witness into present active tense. And The Insanity of Obedience dares to say that everything that God has ever done, God is still doing. And The Insanity of Obedience is a book from the believers in persecution who share with us what it means to be a wise partner with Jesus Christ. What a gift. What a treasure. What an opportunity.
Can we pause now and ponder on Ripken's words? He said, "What is a dagger in the heart to believers in persecution is our lack of understanding with how we connect with them. We've got a decision that we make every day. We can ask ourselves this question: do I want to identify with believers in persecution, or do I want to identify with their persecutors? Do I want to identify with the person in chains, or do I want to identify with the person who chained them?" And when you ask them, "Well, how do I determine who I identify with?" they say, "By whether or not today you share Jesus with someone else, or you keep him to yourself." These are confronting and disturbing words to us here in Australia, indeed in the so-called free world. Our sisters and brothers in Sudan have suffered and continue to suffer unimaginably for their witness to Christ. Let's go to Sudan so we can learn from and connect with our faithful family there. But first, let's listen to this brief overview titled Darfur in 10 Minutes. An overview of the conflict in Sudan, so we can gain an understanding of this country and why it has suffered so many decades of violence and tragedy. Pete McCormick, who compiled this report, interviewed his friend Ivan, who had worked for many years in humanitarian relief in Africa. Here is Ivan's confronting commentary on the Darfur nightmare.
Darfur is a complex conflict, and of course you can't ascribe simple drivers to it, but I think there are three drivers that, properly understood, can shed a lot of light on the situation. And those three would be ethnicity, oil, and desertification. Now if I start with ethnicity, well obviously in a lot of these kinds of conflicts ethnicity is a main driver. There's a lot of ethnic hatred, and that, under the right circumstances, could blossom into the most incredible violence. Now, what is the Sudan, this country that contains the Darfur region? It's effectively three really disparate regions thrown together into one country by the departing colonial power, Britain. And like most African borders, the border around the country of Sudan bears very little relationship to any kind of geographical truth or any demographic truth, and it has not much to do with the people there. Now the north of Sudan, ethnically Arabic, religiously Muslim, is one sort of solitude, which borders on the Red Sea. So you've got the Port Sudan up there, and you've got the capital city of Khartoum. The south of Sudan, which is ethnically black and religiously Christian, is yet another solitude. Those two actually didn't even come together until after independence, with some fairly catastrophic results. And then you've got western Sudan, the Darfur, or the land of the Fur, where the Fur tribe, as well as the Masalit and the Zagawa live, as well as various Arab and affiliated nomadic tribes. Now the Fur, the Masalit, and the Zagawa are ethnically black, religiously Muslim. Now the ethnicity, the hatreds, are fostered by this sort of hierarchy where the more Arabic or the paler skinned you are, the higher you are in the hierarchy, or the more advanced you're considered to be. So the Arabs in Khartoum, the Muslim Arabs in the capital city, and that capital city incidentally was founded as a slave market to sell black people. Now they consider themselves proudly Arabs, and they really look down on black people. In fact, they use a very nasty word for black people, which means slave. Now they themselves would be referred to by Saudi Arabs by that same very nasty word for a black person. Now the people in the south identify themselves as black, and the people in the west also, the three main tribes in the Darfur, they consider themselves ethnically black. And they don't feel like that's a good thing. Being black means effectively that you get, well, you get kicked around by everyone else. Also, within this area, there are ethnically Arabic tribes who look indistinguishable to the black tribes, to my eye, to most Western eyes. And often they can tell one another apart only by accent or last name. But these nomadic herding tribes, who are more culturally affiliated with the Arab government in Khartoum, live within the population of the Darfur. So there's already this ethnic tension in place, and this terrible hierarchy and these terrible ideas of superiority between the various African peoples. Now let's talk about the second driver, which is oil. And what oil really functions as is a proxy for international conflict. Wherever there's oil, there's people jockeying for position and jockeying for that money. What you've got in the south of Sudan is oil wells. In the north of Sudan, you've got the port. You need both. So in the south where they have the oil wells, the oil is being extracted, but the people in Khartoum in the north, where they have the port, are the ones who are seeing the payments come in. And that's had a lot to do with why they're able to keep power and hold power. And where does that oil go? Well, it goes to a few different countries. Canada has had some involvement in the Sudan. Talisman Oil out of Calgary certainly supported the Sudanese government for a time. But 70% or more of the oil out of the Sudan goes to China. So all of the money was staying in the northern part, and the southern tribes said, well, why aren't we seeing any of the benefits from this? Why aren't we having roads and hospitals and schools and any of the infrastructure that would normally come with a government that's got some kind of a budget? And they asked that question of the north, and back in the 1980s the government said, well, because we have the money, why would we give it to you? So they launched a rebellion. And that southern rebellion raged for 22 years of absolutely horrendous violence and horrendous atrocities on both sides, and eventually the South won. And with that came, at least on paper, 49% of the oil revenues came down to the South. So that meant suddenly, at least in theory, there's infrastructure, education, healthcare going to the south of Sudan. Now over in the West, Darfur is left out of this. And these ethnically black, religiously Muslim, so not terribly related to the other two groups, said, well, what about us? Why aren't we seeing any schools and roads and infrastructure? So the West launched their own rebellion. And it's amazing what you can accomplish with very limited military means. And the Sudanese government was actually feeling quite pressed. Pushed on the west by the Darfur rebels, always a little unsure of the peace with the south, harried on the Eritrean border by unrelated external conflicts, definitely in a dicey position. So they came back to their friends the Chinese. And the Sudanese government said to the Chinese, we're having difficulty with this rebellion. And the Chinese said, well, we can help with that. To secure our oil supply, we can supply you with all kinds of good modern military weapons. So they supplied Antonov bombers and helicopter gunships and Kalashnikov AK-47 rifles. And the Sudanese government came up with a new way to fight a war. And to fight this rebellion, they decided to get the fish by draining the sea. The fish are the rebels. The sea is the civilian population of Western Sudan, the civilians of Darfur. So the modus operandi is quite simple. You take a village of black agricultural tribespeople who are considered to be rebel sympathizers, which they probably are, and you soften it up with bombs from an Antonov bomber overhead during the night. And then at dawn come in with a helicopter gunship with a high-powered machine gun. And after that, the Janjaweed, the devils on horseback, ride in, nomadic Arab tribespeople from Western Sudan, sponsored and financed by the government, and they start shooting up the rest of the civilians. And they rape the women on a very large scale. It's one of the larger instances of organized rape in history. And then they burn all of the houses. And the hatred is so extreme that they'll actually dig up food stores and use petroleum that they've purchased. They'll use diesel oil that they've had to buy from the market to pour on the food stores and destroy them. And then they'll throw dead bodies in the wells to make sure that the village never recovers. So there we have oil functioning as sort of a proxy for international interference. The people who are buying these resources coming out of these poor countries are supporting the governments that may or may not be acceptable to their own peoples and giving them military, financial support. So the third driver then is desertification. How did the government convince these tribes, the ethnic Arab tribes in the west of Darfur, to turn against their own people and start massacring the other tribes of the Darfur? Well, historically, the herders, the ethnic Arab herders of the Darfur region, and the ethnically black farmers had a bit of an understanding. If a farmer had a field of grains and a cow walked through it and trashed it, well, the herder had to pay some kind of grazing rights to the farmer. And for thousands of years, they coexisted with certainly a certain amount of tension. Always throughout history, there's tension between herders and farmers. And though there were skirmishes and there were certainly problems, there was an existing social structure whereby there were grazing rights for cattle who went through a farmer's field, and farmers would allow that. now the Sahara Desert is extending. And this may or may not be related to the climate change that we're causing here in the West, but whatever the cause may be, there's no longer enough for everyone. The farmers and the herders do not have enough arable land and enough water to irrigate to actually sustain those old accords. So the fact is, the Darfur region is no longer able to sustain the lifestyle that the people had, which was not a very luxurious lifestyle. This is a hard region. And now it's even harder, to the point where, though the match was struck by these drivers of ethnic hatred and external forces supplying arms and financial incentives, the fuel for this fire really was created by the fact that there just isn't enough for everyone anymore. And so all of those three drivers work together to create a sort of a perfect storm of massacre and despair. And in fact, there's going to be oil, there's going to be people jockeying for that oil. There is this terrible ethnicity and these terrible hatreds that are not going away anytime soon. And certainly I don't see any reversal in the desertification of North Africa. As long as those three things remain in place, it's going to be very difficult to mitigate the conflict in Darfur.
To get the fish by draining the sea. Ivan explained, quote, "The fish are the rebels. The sea is the civilian population of Western Sudan. You take a village of black agricultural tribespeople and you soften it up with bombs from an Antonov bomber overhead during the night. And then at dawn, come in with a helicopter gunship with a high-powered machine gun. And after that, the Janjaweed, the devils on horseback, ride in, nomadic Arab tribespeople from Western Sudan, sponsored and financed by the government, and they start shooting up the rest of the civilians, and they rape the women on a very large scale. And then they burn all of the houses. And the hatred is so extreme that they will actually dig up food stores and use petroleum that they have purchased to pour on the food stores and destroy them. And then they will throw dead bodies in the wells to make sure that the village never recovers. Ethnicity, oil, desertification, the perfect storm of massacre and despair. Welcome to Sudan. song we've just heard was sung in Zulu, and the English translation is, "Come, defender, this load is too heavy." Surely this is the cry of Christian believers in Sudan today. Sudan is number 11 on Open Doors' World Watch list of the 50 most difficult countries to be a follower of Jesus in. Its leader is President Omar al-Bashir. The government is a republic, and Islam is the dominant religion. Sudan's population is approximately 45.7 million, and the number of Christians is unknown. Islamic extremism is the major engine of persecution in this country. Reading from Voice of the Martyrs webpage. The civil war, which ended in 2005, claimed the lives of 2 million people. A continuing conflict in Darfur has driven 2 million more from their homes and killed over 200,000. Sudan and South Sudan split into two separate countries in 2011, and conditions in Sudan have deteriorated since South Sudan's independence. Although the constitution guarantees religious freedom, Islam remains the de facto state religion, and apostasy is punishable by death under the government's Sharia law. Barnabas Fund in a July 2012 report stated, Sudan's President Omar Hassan al-Bashir has proclaimed the country's next constitution will be 100% Islamic to set an example for neighbouring countries. The President's formal statement on July 7 comes amid significant shifts in North African countries where Islamist parties are gaining influence and positions of power. He said, quote, "We want to present a constitution that serves as a template to those around us, and our template is clear. A 100% Islamic constitution without communism or secularism or Western influences." End quote. Sharia or Islamic law is already in force in Sudan, which is 98% Muslim. But the President seems intent on formalising its authority and enforcing it more strictly, making the position of the Christian minority increasingly vulnerable following the secession of the largely Christian South Sudan last year. And in another Barnabas Fund post we read, "They told me I must cooperate with them in giving them the names of Muslims who have changed their religion. And they asked me about the whereabouts of my friend, a guy who was a Muslim and became a Christian." A Christian man who fled Sudan in 2013 described how the authorities there are trying to track down Christian converts from Islam. Officials threatened to kill him for refusing to divulge names. The persecution of apostates who are legally punishable by death in Sudan is only one part of a targeted and ruthless campaign being waged by the Islamist government against the country's Christian minority. Sudanese Christians have been arrested, interrogated and detained without charge. Churches are being demolished and Christian institutions closed. And Christian literature has been seized. A media drive against alleged Christianization led to the deportation of numerous foreign Christian workers. The government has said that it will not grant any more licenses for new church buildings. President Omar al-Bashir has made clear his intention to make Sudan a fully Islamic state. And since the secession of the mainly Christian South Sudan in 2011, the process of Islamization has accelerated. Although a strict version of Sharia is already in force, the new constitution is expected further to limit religious freedom. Hundreds of thousands of Christians from South Sudan, many of whom were driven from their homes by decades of civil war, are effectively being forced out of the country by government intimidation and harassment. But many lack the money or resources to move their families and possessions to South Sudan. Hostility towards any remaining Christian presence in Sudan is growing, and some observers believe that the government's goal may be to eradicate Christianity from the country altogether. Government forces have also been targeting the Nuba Mountains near the border with South Sudan, which has one of the largest Christian populations in the country. The purpose of their brutal air and ground campaign appears to be to, quote, cleanse unquote, the region of its non-Arabs and non-Muslims. Thousands have fled their homes to escape the violence and are now stuck in crowded refugee camps in the south.
Deep is the river that I have to cross, heavy the weight on my shoulder. I have discovered how great is the cost of trying alone to cross over. I try and I try, but the current's too strong. It's pulling me under, and my strength is gone. Don't leave me stranded. Rescue me, my God and my King. The waters are rising and I cannot breathe. Wrap your arms all around me, carry me over. Rescue, carry me over. There is a bridge that is easy to cross, where all of our burdens are lifted. And peace is the land that is waiting for us. Lord, give me faith to believe it. 'Cause I'm in a storm, but I'm willing to fight. I'll overcome, and I will not die. With you by my side, rescue me, my God and my King. The waters are rising and I cannot breathe. Wrap your arms all around me, carry me over. Carry me over. And we'll sail over the oceans and fly over the mountains and soar up to the heavens. Here is my hand, is my heart, is my soul, and my life. Rescue me, my God and my King. The waters are rising and I cannot breathe. Wrap your arms all around me, carry me over. Rescue me, my God and my King. You are the only one who can save me. Wrap your arms all around me, carry me over. Carry me over. Carry me over. Rescue me.
Let's now hear about the refugee situation in South Sudan at this time. The following report comes from Samaritan's Purse, June 2014.
The neighbor over here, they were there when the rebel forces came in. They had 6 children. They jumped in one of 4 boats, but 3 of those 4 boats capsized in the Nile River in the dark of the night. They had their 6 kids. The father grabbed the 3 older ones, his wife grabbed the 3 little ones, and they swam. And when they got to shore, the father had his 3 and his wife didn't have any. She was 9 months pregnant. And he said his wife crawled up on the beach, went into labor, and delivered a healthy baby. Really, how do you deal with that kind of pain? And yet, almost every family here has that kind of pain.
These are all innocent people. They're in no way partaking in the fighting. They don't agree with it. They're just victims of an unjust war.
There is a strong conviction within me that comes from the bottom of my heart. People are suffering, they don't have food, they don't have shelter, they don't have water.
I can't even imagine what it's like to have your house destroyed, to lose your family members. I just want to do as much as I can to help every life that we can.
If I can play a part, then maybe God can use me to transform lives within.
We have now repaired 13 wells in the county. We also are constructing the trains, bathing shelters for the displaced families. We are distributing soap and training on health and hygiene to prevent the outbreak of disease. Thousands and thousands of people are just stranded on islands in the River Nile. Everyone who has tried to return home has been killed, so they're just stuck living on these islands. We're about to distribute blankets, sleeping mats, mosquito nets, buckets, and water treatment chemicals for these people here.
Certainly in my years in Africa, I've taken care of spears through the chest and stuff like that, but not shrapnel injuries, not kids who've been bombed. I think that's one of the things about being here that is most painful, is to see what innocent people are suffering.
Kev! Kweisa?
Yeah, I've been really blessed to work with Dr. Achar. Dr. Rov's been a great addition. When they come in with their attitude and their smiles and their jokes and all of their laughter, I think that raises the spirits of our nurses and our patients and really shows them that this is not the end.
They can see God through their pains. They can see God through even the deaths of their relatives and their friends. I met a pastor just came to me, say, James, pray for me because I can't handle the pain that I'm going through. He said, I lost my grandmother. I lost my two brothers and sisters. My sisters also have been killed. He doesn't know why God saved him at that moment. I said, God has a purpose for you. So we need to pray for them. We need to, remember them.
The bottom line is it's an opportunity that God has given us out of this terrible adversity to share the gospel. And honestly, thousands of people are coming to Christ who would never come.
We have seen people who did not have hope, at least beginning to have hope. People who could not smile, at least you can see a smile on the faces of people. And for me, that's what gives me the joy, and it gives me the drive every day to do what I do.
Christians in our country in South Sudan today believe the only hope for this nation is Jesus. They can see God through their pains. They can see God through even the death of their relatives and their friends. The bottom line is it's an opportunity that God has given us out of this terrible adversity to share the gospel, and honestly, thousands of people are coming to Christ who would never come. Let me ask you a question. What do you think is the only hope for this country? A change of government? An easing of our taxes? Better social security and superannuation options? More stuff? Fatter bank accounts? Will any of these things give us a sure, unshakable hope? Christian believers in Sudan have come to know they have but one hope, one anchor, one option, one eternal security, the Lord Jesus Christ. What must Christians in Australia lose before we arrive at the same conviction?
Fresh page, new pen, where do I begin? Words fail, tears come, I need someone to take the thoughts I almost think and carry them to God for me. Deep breath, exhale, breathe in deeper still. Long sigh, I am still numb. Is there anyone who can find the things I'm barely feeling and give them wings beyond my ceiling? Right heart, wrong place, it's too far to outer space. Sorry I forgot, you're right here. I cup my hands around your ear. I feel you smile, you feel my breath. You listen while I whisper nonsense. Simple exchange, your will, I'm changed, and now my prayer ends. Thank you, amen.
Miriam Yahia Ibrahim became the face of persecution of Christian believers in Sudan when she was arrested February 2014 on apostasy charges. Prisoner Alert posted the following article 3 months later. We read, "On May 15, 2014, a Khartoum court sentenced 27-year-old Sudanese Christian Dr. Miriam Yahia Ibrahim to death. She was found guilty of both apostasy and adultery. Initially, Miriam was charged with adultery because of her marriage to a Christian man, and the apostasy charge was added upon Miriam's insistence that she was a Christian. Under Sudanese law, because Miriam's father was Muslim, she is considered Muslim. Though she explained to the court that she was raised by a Christian mother and never practiced Islam, in the court's eyes, her marriage to a Christian was void and she was guilty of adultery. The court later added the charge of apostasy, or leaving the Islamic faith, when Miriam continued to insist she was a Christian. Before sentencing, the judge gave Miriam 3 days to recant her Christian faith, but when the court reconvened on Thursday, May 15th, she remained resolute. "I am a Christian," she said. She was sentenced to 100 lashes for adultery and to death by hanging for apostasy. At the time of sentencing, Miriam was 8 months pregnant with her second child. Application of her sentence of 100 lashes will be carried out after she has recovered from giving birth, and her death sentence is delayed for 2 years after the birth of her child to give her time to nurse her infant. Her daughter Maya was born in the prison on May 27th. Miriam's 20-month-old son Martin has been with her in prison since her arrest on February 17th. Because Miriam's husband Daniel Wani is a Christian, the Sudanese government sees him as an unfit father. Daniel Wani emigrated to the US from Sudan in 1998 and became a US citizen in 2005. He met Miriam at church on a visit to Sudan, and the two were married in December 2011. Daniel, who suffers from muscular dystrophy and is wheelchair-bound, went to Sudan last summer to arrange for his wife and son to move to his home in New Hampshire. In the interim, someone claiming to be Miriam's brother alerted authorities to her possible apostasy. In court, Miriam testified that she was born in Darfur and raised by an Ethiopian mother, a Christian. Her father left the family when she was 6. She denied knowing any of the people claiming to be her relatives. On May 28th, the Sudanese embassy to the US issued a statement on the case. Quote, "This case remains a legal issue and not a religious or political one. It is unwise and dangerous to politicize the issue at hand to spur religious tension between the two peaceful faiths with similar foundations. Notably, it is important to emphasize that freedom of choice is the cornerstone of both Islam and Christianity." End quote. The Sudanese government also denied earlier reports that Miriam would be released were true. If Miriam is put to death, she will be the first person to be executed for apostasy in Sudan since Sharia law was introduced in the criminal code in 1991. Global prayer and international pressure from governments and human rights groups resulted in Miriam being released on June 23rd, although she was arrested and again detained when attempting to fly out of Khartoum. Now settled in the US with her husband and 2 children, the Telegraph posted this update September 16th. We read, "The Sudanese mother who was sentenced to hang for refusing to reject Christianity has spoken for the first time about her ordeal, saying she was resolved to keep her faith even if it meant death. Miriam Yahya Ibrahim, 27, was pregnant when she was given the death sentence for apostasy by the country's courts under Sharia law. She was freed in late June after an 18-month ordeal following an international outcry and was helped to travel to the US, where her husband Daniel has citizenship. Giving her first interview since she was released last month, she told Fox News she was given 3 days to renounce her faith by the Sudanese authorities, and when she refused, was sentenced to hang. In prison, she said she was visited every day by imams who recited parts of the Quran to her in an attempt to pressure her into renouncing her religion. While I was in prison, some people came to visit me from the Muslim Scholars Association, she said. These were imams that created an intervention by reciting parts of the Quran for me. I faced a tremendous amount of pressure. I had my trust in God," she said. "My faith was the only weapon that I had in these confrontations with imams and Muslim scholars, because that's what I believe." Miss Ibrahim, who insisted she had been a Christian all her life, was forced to give birth in prison to daughter Maya. "I was supposed to give birth at a hospital outside of prison, but they denied that request as well," she said. "When it was time to give birth, they refused to remove the chains from my ankles, so I had to give birth with chains on my ankles." Sudan initially blocked Ibrahim from leaving the country even after its highest court overturned her death sentence in June. The family took refuge at the US Embassy in Khartoum. Miss Ibrahim, who now lives in New Hampshire with her husband Daniel and 2 children, said other Christian prisoners were told any debts they had would be written off if they converted to Islam. "I would never leave my faith," she said. "If you don't have faith, you are not alive. I put my life at risk for the women of Sudan and for Christians living under difficult circumstances, persecuted and treated harshly. There are many Miriams in Sudan and throughout the world." I would like to end this edition of For Eternity by reading from The Guardian's June 2014 article titled "Why the Left Must Speak Up About the Persecution of Christians." We read, "Miriam Ibrahim's plight should draw attention to the persecution of Christians across the globe. It is an issue not discussed enough by progressives, partly perhaps because of a fear that it has become a hobby horse of Muslim bashers. Anti-Muslim websites like Jihad Watch seize on examples of Christian persecution to fuel the narrative of Muslims as innately violent and threatening. According to Rupert Short, who wrote Christianophobia, A Faith Under Attack, the persecution of Christians is a, quote, liberal blind spot, unquote, suggesting that we are, quote, very, very sensitized to the perceived sufferings and complaints of Muslims, many of which I will be the first to say are justified, unquote. I think this counterposing is unhelpful. According to the Pew Research Centre, Christians and Muslims are united in being the two most persecuted religious groups on earth. In 2012, Christians faced oppression in 110 countries and Muslims have suffered in 109. What should worry us is a general deterioration in interreligious relations, according to Pew. 33% of countries had high religious hostilities in 2012, a dramatic jump from 20% in 2007. Sudan is far from the worst offender. It scores 11th on the World Watch list of Open Doors UK, a charity fighting for the rights of persecuted Christians. North Korea's totalitarian dictatorship tops the list. Tens of thousands of Christians are believed to be locked up in Gulag-style work camps, although it should be said that life is hardly a bundle of laughs for many other North Koreans either. In Nigeria, Boko Haram have targeted Christians along with ordinary Muslims in the country's northeast. In Sri Lanka, meanwhile, over 2,000 Christians protested earlier this year over a lack of religious freedom and attacks by Buddhist extremists on their places of worship. It is unsurprisingly the Middle East where the situation for Christians has dramatically deteriorated in recent years. One of the legacies of the invasion of Iraq has been the purging of a Christian community that has lived there for up to 2 millennia. It is a crime of historic proportions. We can't be sure about the figures, but up to 3/4 of the country's Christians have fled. On Christmas Day last year, 35 Christians were killed in targeted car bombs. In neighbouring Syria, Islamist fundamentalist groups have stipulated that Christians must either convert to their interpretation of Islam, pay a compulsory tax worth 14 grams of pure gold and accept strict restrictions on worship, or face execution. And then there's our staunch ally, the thuggish regime in Saudi Arabia, which is the only country on earth to ban all churches or other non-Muslim places of worship, forbids the distribution of Bibles, and threatens those who convert to Christianity with a death sentence. Last year, for instance, Saudi courts sentenced men to lashes and jail for allegedly converting a woman to Christianity. This is a nation we arm to the teeth. Last year alone, we sold this nightmarish regime £1.6 billion worth of military goods. Those of us on the left who advocate religious acceptance and diversity must surely speak louder about the persecution of Christians. The suffering and oppression is real, and in many places getting ever worse. If we do not speak out, the danger is it will be left to those with ulterior motives who wish to hijack misery to fuel religious hatred, with disastrous consequences. There are many Miriams in Sudan and throughout the world. Please remember them, pray for them, learn about them, and act in whatever way you are called to be a voice for them and Christ's hands and feet to them. This is Helen Motti for Eternity.
For Eternity is produced in the studios of Rima FM Port Macquarie.